My name is David Fagerberg. I'm in the theology department here at Notre Dame, and it's an honor to introduce our speaker this afternoon, and it's a special satisfaction to me personally so that I can publicly thank Tris for his many kindnesses to me. Professor Engelhardt holds the distinction of being a doctor. I mean, he is a philosopher-physician. He is professor of philosophy and professor of medicine, having apparently accomplished the saintly art of bilocation. He plays his former role at Rice University and the latter at Baylor College of Medicine. Admiration of this preternatural ability to bilocate in two faculties is lessened by the fact that both schools are located in Houston, Texas. But Professor Engelhardt will be quick to tell us that everything located in Texas is itself sufficient cause for admiration. Professor Engelhardt will also be quick to tell you that he speaks from the perspective afforded him by a formation in the Orthodox Christian tradition. From the Egyptian desert of the 4th century, Evagrius of Pontus said there were 3 stages in the monastic life: practica, physica, and theologia. It would seem to me then that between being an ascetic and a theologian, one must become a physician. This is something different from either the medical or the scientific kind. Though ascetical physica is the kind of physic which heals, like the former, by means of knowing the world properly, like the latter. A true philosopher would know what matter is for, and therefore know the cure for what is the matter with the world, a facility we doubt modernity still possesses. So in his paper, Professor Engelhardt proposes to consider the historical roots of modernity's lost theological worldview, point out the differences between the world of traditional Christianity and the world of modernity, and diagnose the conflicts these differences engender. We welcome you to the podium.
Professor Fagerberg, let me thank you very much for your generous introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, congratulate you on your courage to come to a postprandial lecture by a philosopher from Texas. I'll try my best to deliver the paper in English rather than in Texan. But if you have any questions, do reserve them to the end. I'm going to try more or less to read the paper through. Have heard myself talk so often, if I didn't read it through, I'd probably go to sleep someplace in the delivery. As I stood this year on September the 13th at the Vesperial Liturgy for the exaltation of the Holy Cross, I was once again confronted by the circumstance that we live after Christendom. Indeed, we live in a vigorously post-Christian age. The choir intoned, "O Lord, save thy people and bless thine inheritance, granting to our believing kings victory over the barbarians, and by the power of thy cross, preserving thy commonwealth." As with every time I hear the original version of the Troparion, I recalled that the Christian empire of more than a millennium and a half had died with the martyrdom of St. Nicholas I, the last Tsar of Holy Russia. Christendom is no more. We have spent the inheritance bequeathed to us from St. Constantine the Great. There is no longer a Christian commonwealth. We live in a post-Christian age. Nowhere, except perhaps on Mount Athos, where the flag of the Holy Roman Empire still flies, is there a remnant of Christendom. Our age is now so far beyond its rupture from Christendom that Christendom is largely forgotten. We live in the confines of a dominant culture that seeks to make its Christian past not even a past of the present, its modern age. That is, the present age has come to regard its roots in the intellectual and political revolutions that produce the modern secular culture, and not in the pre-revolutionary, pre-modern Christian culture. This contemporary culture, in its passion to make itself anew, cannot acknowledge that it is rooted in Christendom. It is determined to construe its origins in terms of a new beginning, a fresh, secular, intellectual foundation. The present of this modern age is framed by a hermeneutic directed to a liberation from superstition and from towards rightly ordered secular frameworks of justice and human rights. One might think of Immanuel Kant's pleadings in his Religion Within the Bounds of Reason Alone. The past, which is at the roots of modernity, has its roots in a foundation that would define itself quite apart from that of Christendom. Matters, I will argue, are not quite the way many protagonists and foes of modernity might put them. Modernity, I will argue, despite its protest to the contrary, has its roots deep in the high Western Middle Ages. Modernity's roots, if one looks carefully, are in the Christendom that preceded modernity and established a commitment to philosophy's discursive power in the very heart of its theology. Modernity's roots are in a fateful turn of Christian theology to a liaison with secular philosophy, which redefined its appreciation of theology and spirituality. This turn to secular philosophy was made with the laudable but mistaken goal of strengthening theology. As a consequence, the logos of theology was recast in terms of the logos of philosophy. The West has forgotten the warning of Clement of Alexandria, and I quote, "The teaching, which is according to the Savior, is complete in itself and without defect, being the power and the wisdom of God, and the Hellenic philosophy does not, by its approach, make that truth more powerful." Once the relation of philosophy and theology is altered, one alters radically the appreciation of theology and with it the Christian life. The Christian spiritual life becomes tied to the life of the intellect rather than to that of the nous, the pure heart, that, as Christ is recorded in Matthew 5:8, that can see God. These changes began in the first centuries of the second millennium as philosophy was transformed from an obedient handmaiden of theology, devoted to the drudgery of mere conceptual clarification and the framing of distinctions, to the more exalted position of aiding in the development of theology itself. In time, theology became subject to the demands of its consort, philosophy. Through this liaison, philosophy transformed not only theology, but Western culture itself. It is for this reason that the contemporary Italian philosopher, Gianni Vattimo, can assert, the West is secularized Christianity and nothing else. In this, he is right. The current age is a further development of the Christian medieval synthesis that led to philosophy finally, in the end, secularizing theology. This secularized theology took at least two forms. In one, the traditional claims of Christianity were recast to conform to the moral and metaphysical expectations of contemporary philosophy. In the second, the concerns of traditional theology, Christian theology, with the pursuit of holiness, were fully transformed into contemporary commitments to human rights and social justice, thus fully vindicating Vattimo's claim that the contemporary world is simply secularized Christianity. In both cases, the framework of traditional Christianity was undermined, leading to the radical secular culture of modernity. These are bold claims. To show their plausibility, a number of points will be developed. First, the contrast between modernity and pre-modernity must be at least quickly laid out in greater detail. Second, the second millennium, not only an account must be given of why the liaison of philosophy with theology that developed and took shape in the early second millennium was not only misguided, but out of its misdirection produced the post-Christian character of modernity itself. As to modernity, let me summarize some of the differences that set modernity over against traditional Christianity. Here you have the handout, and what I've tried there is to aim towards sketching out what is at best a fuzzy concept. That is, not one that has an essence, but is composed of a number of component markers that in different ways set us over against that is our dominant culture over against the culture of traditional Christianity. The list is not meant to be exhaustive, but rather heuristic. In laying out this contrast, I do not mean to assert that we all live within the assumptions and commitments of modernity. One must distinguish between the dominant culture and the cultural commitments of particular traditional communities. Finally, and most importantly, by modernity, I identify the post-Enlightenment secular culture of the late 20th century and early 21st century, the last in a series of modernities. As a point of departure, one might consider the following contrast. And then if you look at the handout, I contrast between a culture that sees itself focused on transcendent goals versus immanent goals, an infinite horizon versus accepting a finite horizon, one that's God-centered versus one that's human-centered, one that recognizes the presence of the uncreated energies of God along with physical powers, versus one that recognizes the presence of only physical powers, the weak force, the strong force, gravitational force, electromagnetic force. The one that is an enchanted world where one knows and lives and experiences the presence of spirits, devils, angels, spiritual powers, versus a disenchanted world blind to the presence of angels, devils, and spiritual powers. One that's dependent on God as well as human resources versus one simply dependent on human resources. One that yearns for the infinite, and a modern world where yearning for human flourishing has been defined within the horizon of the finite and the immanent, such that the goods available through the pursuit of self-fulfillment, self-realization, and self-satisfaction define human flourishing. One that, as a traditional Christian culture, focuses on asceticism and submission versus modernity, which focuses on liberation and autonomy and equality. One that sees religion as providing the truth versus religion as a tradition. When I didn't interrupt him, he said I was brought up in a tradition, as if it were one narrative amongst others in a great ecumenical field. Theology is seen in traditional Christian understanding as the primary science, versus the modern world where the empirical sciences are seen as the primary source of truth. It is a contrast between the standpoint of religion having epistemological priority versus the standpoint of science having, empirical science, as having epistemological priority. It's one where prayer, more than anything else, one knows, changes the world versus a modern world where one thinks technology primarily changes the world. One in which there is a metaphysical anchor where truth is recognized as absolute and transcending the world of appearances, versus modernity, which lives after metaphysics. There's a blindness to ultimate orientation so that all facts become interpretation within a particular hermeneutic. It is one where the ecclesial direction, the direction of public culture is ecclesial versus one where there's secular direction of public culture. One in which Christianity defines the public space versus a secular culture that defines the public space, such that Christianity is marginalized and privatized. One where religion and sexual life are matters of moral concern. One can make the terrible mistake of having a wrong religion or living a sexually perverted life, versus in modernity, where religious and sexual life are matters of ascetic, private concern. One in traditional Christianity which has a gender essentialism, where one affirms ontological differences between men and women so that it acknowledges, for example, women cannot be priestesses, versus a gender anti-essentialism where it affirms sexual roles as simply social constructs and outcomes of individual choice. It's one in which the traditional understanding of obedience and obligations to God regarding man are held to be central to the pursuit of holiness and salvation, where, in contrast, in modernity, equality, liberty, and human rights are held to be central to the moral life. Of all the points of difference, the last one you see between living in a traditional versus a post-traditional context, The final contrast between a culture that is traditional and one that is post-traditional is the most important. A traditional culture affirms epistemological premises that support the reliability of core received commitments. These commitments support a connection with the past this commitment support a connection with the past that makes the past present. A traditional culture recognizes that there are enduring truths and moral insights that sustain human flourishing. Moreover, a traditional culture affirms rules of evidence at odds with a post-traditional culture. Post-traditional cultures, for their part, are marked by a cult of the new. Modernity conceives itself as a never-ending progress from darkness and oppression to enlightenment and liberation. In these reflections on the cultural divide between pre-modernity and post-modernity, the notion of a traditional Christian culture is placed centrally. By traditional Christianity, I mean the Christianity of the first half millennium of Christianity. I refer to this Christianity as traditional Christianity. In developing my points, with one exception, I will focus on the reflections of the church of the first half millennium, particularly on St. John Chrysostom. The exception is the use I will make of contemporary Orthodox theologians. This exception is made because Orthodox Christianity lives in the minds of the fathers, in a theological now that directs its community to an unbroken unity in the Holy Spirit, so that past and future and present are one. On all these points just advanced, and in contrast with modernity, Orthodox Christianity is at one with traditional Christian culture. You've now made it to two sections, though you couldn't tell it. We're now in section 3, and it bears the title, Truth, Knowledge, and the Good Life. First, it is crucial to note why and how the church of the first half millennium was keen to keep philosophy in her place. This requires drawing out some distinctions regarding the different meanings of philosophy and theology. Over the 2.5 millennium history of Western philosophical and theological reflections, these terms have compassed, that is, philosophy and theology, a wide range of practices that at best enjoy family resemblances. The term philosophy, for its part, ranges over at least the following endeavors. And now you go back to your handout, you see I lay out at least 9 senses of philosophy. Philosophy is a way of life involving an imminent pursuit of virtue and human excellence, most especially wisdom. One might think of the Epicureans. Philosophy as the pursuit of immediate knowledge, noetic knowledge of a transcendent reality, guided not by special revelation, held to have occurred in the past, but by intellectual intuition and or discursive reason, at least one plausible account we will make of Plotinus. 3, philosophy as the philosophy of nature, in the sense of rational reflection on the structure of reality and on empirical experience. Greek atomists, at least in some accounts one would give of them. 4, philosophy as the discursive, speculative exploration of the nature of being, including metaphysics, both general and special, for example, rational psychology. 5, philosophy as the pursuit of clarity in claims through engaging and framing conceptual distinctions. 6, philosophy as the disciplined description and analysis of what is presented to consciousness, phenomenology. 7, philosophy as the conceptual analysis of the character and soundness of claims, arguments, and ways of regarding reality and morality, contemporary analytic and hermeneutic philosophy. 8, philosophy as the use of reasoning to support and advance the plausibility of one's religious, metaphysical, and moral position, although the arguments and analyses that are offered are not considered sufficient by themselves to establish one's position by sound, rational argument. As with the sophists and with many rhetoricians and with early Christian apologists. If one looks at the University of Constantinople, founded in 425, naturally, thank God, it had no theologian in its faculty. It had philosophers and it had rhetoricians. It understood you had to market the faith. 9, philosophy as the pursuit of and or expression of the truth of Christianity, guided by the Holy Spirit. Philosophy in the last sense, that is, philosophy as the pursuit or expression of the truth of Christianity. Philosophy in the last sense is materially equivalent to the traditional Christian understanding of theology. This understanding occurs in the text of divine services, as in the Vespers for Pentecost, where it is intoned, "When thou didst send thy Holy Spirit, O Lord," the apostles philosophized, driving the Gentiles to the faith as they preached of things divine. It is also the sense of philosophy employed when monks are characterized as the true philosophers. This is not the philosophy of either the Western Middle Ages or modernity or my philosophy department at Rice. So too, the term theology encompasses disparate practices. Though three of the four uses identify academic disciplines that can be found in universities and or seminarians, the third sense is liturgical, ascetic, noetic, rather than academic. These senses of theology include: 1, discursive, systematic reflection on the nature of being and of existence, so as to demonstrate the nature and existence of God, as well as the relation and duties of created beings to their Creator. This sense of theology engages philosophy in the fourth sense, namely metaphysical reasoning, especially that special metaphysics, usually termed natural theology, which developed to its fullness in the Western Middle Ages. 2, the systematic analysis of religious concepts, claims, arguments, and ways of regarding religious truth. This is a species of the seventh sense of philosophy. It is tantamount to the philosophy of religion, with the cardinal difference that the truth of a particular revealed religion is granted as its foundation. Not only are the implications of a particular religious revelation drawn out, they are combined with philosophical understanding, so that within the genre of theology, the breadth and depth of theological claims can grow and dogma can develop. 3, theology as a practice of pursuing a relationship with God through prayer, fasting, asceticism, vigils, almsgiving, that can lead through grace to an unmediated knowledge of God. Theology in this sense involves turning oneself to God. It begins in the will, in repentance, and in turning to God, and not in discursive, rational reflection or contemplation. This sense of theology is the mind of the church, which does not change or develop, because the church is the body of Christ, and Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. 4, theology as the analysis or exegesis of the theological knowledge acquired through theology in the third sense. Such analysis is not strictly dependent on any philosophical account of morality, knowledge, or reality. This form of theology leads to no new knowledge and does not support the development of doctrine, since what it offers must always remain within the confines of theology in the third sense. However, there can be development in the clarity and expression or formulation of dogmas, which developments can then be used in responding to heresies. For the first two senses of theology, philosophy plays a commanding, indeed transformative role. The result is that as philosophical fashions change and different cultural conceits predominate, different basic assumptions and rules of evidence are affirmed, so that theology itself changes. The fourth sense of theology, in being constrained by a sense of theology independent of philosophy, namely the third sense of theology, is in a robust sense anti-modernist. It lives in an understanding of the unchanging mind of the church. It lives in the mind of the fathers. You've now made it to section 4, paradigms and thought styles, conflicting accounts of the relation of philosophy to theology. The contrast between modern and traditional Christian understandings of the proper place of philosophy and philosophical rationality in theology highlights the divergence in epistemological commitments that led to modernity. Consider, for example, an account of the role of the theologian, which emphasizes the centrality of critical standards and rational verification, all of which are set within a background commitment to the positive role of philosophy. While being pre-modern and being theistic, it is modern in locating theology in the context of scientific reflection. As such, It shows the link between the philosophical transformation of theology and the emergence of modern secularity. Here's the quote. Through the course of centuries, theology has progressed, developed into a true and proper science. The theologian must therefore be attentive to the epistemological requirements of his discipline, to the demands of rigorous critical standards, and thus to rational verification of each stage of his research. This is a statement from the Congregation of Doctrine of the Faith. The second comes from the reflections of the late 20th century Orthodox theologian and disciple of St. Silouan the Athonite. St. Silouan the Athonite was one of the great theologians of the 20th century. He reposed in 1938. I think he finished high school, but I'm not sure. His life is recorded by the starets Sophrony, who reposed in 1993. The second sketch of theology is in criticism of the view the first one just illustrated. I quote, "The rationalist theologian is concerned with a multitude of problems whose solutions he seeks through philosophical speculation. His actual religious experience is not very wide. It proceeds mainly from the rational sphere of his being, not merely from a lively communion with God. He counts his scientific erudition and intellectual experience as spiritual riches, rating them so highly that all other knowledge takes second place." Close quote. The second passage identifies traditional Christianity's understanding of theology, sensu stricto, as the fruit of a theological, that is, a holy way of life. In this account, theology in its roots is beyond rational philosophical reflection and speculative metaphysics. These differences involve disparate views of the capacities of philosophy and the proper role of philosophy in theology, and therefore the relation of God to man. To use a Kuhnian construct, these divergences reflect divergent paradigms of what should count as philosophy and theology. Within thought communities structured by thought styles that support disparate views of the proper and powers and role of philosophy, particularly in relationship to theology. As Margaret Masterman noted in her wonderful article about Thomas Kuhn, Kuhn uses paradigm in at least 21 different ways, but they can be summarized under the rubrics of metaphysical paradigms, sociological paradigms, and construct paradigms. If one brings these distinctions, somewhat recast, to the examination of the relationship between philosophy and theology, one can identify one, different understandings of the basic metaphysics or ontology of reality. Traditional Christians recognize that through God's energies, his uncreated manifestations, he can be experienced, though God in his nature is fully transcendent, and therefore in his nature incomprehensible. While in contrast, modernity pressed the force of the analogia entis into the transcendent itself was rendered immanent. 2. Different understandings of the nature of knowledge claims. Noetic knowledge for traditional Christians is the primary mode of theological knowledge, and the description of the experience of God is apophatic. While in contrast, modernity has placed reality and morality within the compass of sense experience and discursive rationality. 3. Different examples of good knowledge distinguish the two paradigms. Theology is grounded for the traditional Christian in the experience of God in contrast to knowledge that is discursively justified. There are different exemplars of reliable knowers for traditional Christians. The most reliable knowers are holy men, not learned scholars and scientists. 5, there are different sociologies of knowledge. Much of the traditional Christian theology was and is undertaken outside of the academy, usually in monasteries, while modernity's knowledge is fully encompassed within the academy and the laboratory, all of which are set within different communities of knowers. To restate this point, regarding the interplay of the role of philosophy and theology and the character of the sociology of theological knowledge, traditional Christian theology is marked by the centrality of monasteries as the place to do theology. The importance of the liturgy for theological insight, and the pastoral homiletic character of much of its exemplar theological texts. In contrast, modern knowledge is generally acquired in the academy and the laboratory. As a consequence, modern theology tends to have a systematic character and is undertaken in a philosophical, discursive, rational mode. Theology for traditional Christianity is a way of life, the pursuit of holiness. In contrast, the undertakings of modernity are at peace within the horizon of the immanent, so that theology is either reconstructed in discursive terms or fully secularized by being translated into moral philosophy. If you ever have picked up many modernist books on moral theology, they're hard to distinguish from a book on moral philosophy. The only distinction is that they tend to cite people who consider themselves moral theologians, but the arguments and considerations are fully philosophical, not theological sensu stricto. You've made it now to the 5th section. Now only 2 more. Philosophy, modernity, and traditional Christianity. Against the background of traditional Christianity's understanding of theology as in its strict sense a noetic experience of God, grounded in a liturgical ascetic way of life, one can now better appreciate the role of philosophy in the secularization of Christianity that produced modernity. Traditional Christianity from the beginning was concerned to put all other forms of philosophy in their place, often condemning uses of philosophy that have become well accepted in modern culture. For example, St. John Chrysostom associates with philosophy, associates with heresy, the use of philosophy to develop theological knowledge. In such cases, there is not just a borrowing of terms from philosophy or an attempt to frame conceptual distinctions, but a reliance on philosophical accounts of morality, anthropology, and being as independent sources of knowledge for the theologian. In particular, a cardinal mistake, according to St. John Chrysostom, would be to employ conclusions taken from moral philosophy, epistemology, and metaphysics in order to develop theological understandings. The traditional Christian view of the role of philosophy in theology reflects the traditional Christian appreciation of knowledge of the Son of God, the Word, the Logos, which contrasts with many and novel Christian interpretations that associate the Logos falsely with discursive rationality. As Father Casimir Kucharik observes, I quote, "In the early Christian era, the Greek logos and pneuma appear with the same meaning, namely spirit. The spirit word terminology, obviously related to the spirit presence of God, is confusing for the modern reader." One sees that in a number of prominent modern readers. Both are precisely probably related to the Jewish notion of the sanctity and the power of the name of God. In Christian usages, both are founded on the actual presence of the heavenly Christ as the quickening spirit, 1 Corinthians 15:45. The original Christian notion of the Logos also appears in the priest's prayers before and after the epiclesis, and the word logikon when the priest speaks of offering the logikon worship. He's not offering a rational or logical worship. This choice of terms reflects Romans 12:1, where St. Paul speaks of a reasonable service, logika latria, which is better rendered a spiritual worship. It is to be noted that St. Paul contrasts his thoughts in 12:1 with a warning not to be conformed to the world. St. John Chrysostom makes his meaning and contrast plain in his commentary on this passage when he remarks that by logike latria, St. Paul means worship that is, and I quote, "without aught that is bodily, gross, or visible," has nothing to do with rationality or logic. St. Paul is surely not asking his readers to engage in a service that will conform to philosophical reflection, rationality, and logic, which he has just condemned. As Kucharik notes, although the term logike is often mistranslated as reasonable, it is more properly construed as spiritual, spiritualized, or immaterial. It is appropriately captured by the Slavonic early translation, Slovesenia. As Kucharik observes, the Greek logikon is actually related to logos, word, the word of God, the second person of the Trinity in the Yodean and patristic sense. When Clement of Alexander applies the corresponding adjective to sheep in one of his hymns, he means by this not reasonable or logical sheep, but sheep of the logos, the good shepherd. That's a quote, and ends the quote from him there. Whatever one might mean by the rationality of God, traditional Christianity holds it is not open to secular philosophy, and it's surely not open to modernity's canons of proper knowledge. Theology sensu stricto reflects the logos, the word of God, revealed in the logos of the cross, as St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1:18, which, as St. Paul takes pains to underscore, is not equivalent to the wisdom of the world, the wisdom of secular philosophy, 1 Corinthians 1:21. The revelation at the beginning of St. John's Gospel that the Word was God is not a justification for placing philosophical rationality at the core of Christian theology. It is this rationality that in the end recasts Christian culture in the image and likeness of modernity. The traditional Christian view regarding the philosophical implications of St. John theologian's beginning of his gospel is made clear in St. John Chrysostom's commentary on the beginning of the Gospel of St. John. St. John Chrysostom does not take the passage, and the Word was God, as a vindication for a role of philosophical rationality in theology. Quite to the contrary. St. John understands this as a revelation beyond secular philosophy, beyond the capacities of speculative reason, and open only to philosophy in the ninth sense, that is the kind of philosophy that ascetic monks engage in. Now I give a fairly long quote from St. John Chrysostom, so if you're going to sleep up to now, fine, you're going to hear from a holy man. The human soul is simply unable to philosophize on that pure and blessed nature that is the Logos, on the powers that come next to it, on immortality and endless life, on the nature of mortal bodies which shall hereafter be immortal, on punishment and the judgment to come, on the inquiries that shall be made as to deeds and words, as to thoughts and imagination. It cannot tell what man is, what the world. What is the nature of virtue? What is the nature of vice? Some of these things, indeed, the disciples of Plato and Pythagoras inquired into. Of the other philosophers we need make no mention. They have all on this part been so excessively ridiculous. And they have composed and written somewhat on the subject of polity and doctrines, and in all have been more shameful and ridiculous than children. I bring the quote to an end. The theology proclaimed by St. John the theologian is appreciated by St. John Chrysostom as grounded in immediate union with God, and therefore as not in need of discursive justification, which would at best be unnecessary and at worst misguiding. Realize St. John the Evangelist is one of the three people in the history of the church ever to be called a theologian. St. John the theologian, St. Gregory the theologian, and St. Simeon the new theologian. St. John Chrysostom's critique of philosophy excludes traditional Christian theology from drawing on philosophy in the first, fourth, sixth, and seventh senses. You have to go back to your handout to see what that is. He does this by stressing that St. John the Evangelist is a true theologian, not because of philosophical knowledge and though actually lacking philosophical education. Instead, his theology is grounded in grace, a knowledge given through the uncreated energies of God. And here I quote again from St. John Chrysostom. This fisherman, John, unlike the pagan philosophers, all he saith is infallible, and standing as it were upon a rock, he never shifts his ground. For since he has been thought worthy to be in the most sacred places, and has the Lord of all speaking within him, he is subject to nothing that is human. But they, the pagan philosophers, like persons who are not held worthy even in a dream to set foot in the king's palace, but who pass their time in the forum with other men, guessing from their own imagination at what they cannot see. they have erred a great error. And like blind or drunken men in their wandering have dashed against each other, and not only against each other, but against themselves by continually changing their opinion, and that ever on the same matters. At stake is not a global skepticism about the possibility of secular knowledge. Constantinople, after all, had the best medicine in all of Europe until the Fourth Crusade, and had flush toilets before my ancestors in Germany could even imagine what that was. Philosophy in the third sense as natural philosophy, in the sense of an investigation of the empirical world, was and is not rejected. What is rejected is philosophy's speculative attempt through discursive reflection, as in the case of moral philosophy, to disclose moral and theological truth, which truth in its fullness is personal, the Trinity. The result is that St. John Chrysostom recognizes philosophy in the first, fourth, sixth, and seventh senses as having been displaced by grace-guiding theology. The significance and grounding of theology are celebrated as having marginalized pagan and more generally secular philosophy. A brief quote again from St. John Chrysostom. And as for the writings of the Greeks, they are all put out and vanished. But this man's, St. John the theologian's, shine brighter day by day. For traditional Christian theology, philosophy in the first, fourth, sixth, and seventh senses is not just irrelevant because the epistemological ground of traditional Christian theology is the experience of God, not sound rational argument, but because such philosophy is in addition misguided because of the investigator dependence of philosophical reflection. The difficulty is, as Clement of Alexandria understood, philosophers must select their own initial foundational premises and rules of evidence without a reliable means to correct for investigator bias. As a result, as St. John Chrysostom notes, philosophy was and is recognized by the fathers as a source of contradictory and false accounts of reality, morality, and particularly God. The point was a matter of significant importance for the early church. St. John Chrysostom and the other fathers of the first century lived in a culture that still was defined by pagan philosophical commitments. They had witnessed the framing of heresies around philosophical reflections drawn from the pagan milieu of the Greco-Roman, Circum-Mediterranean civilization. They were keen to underscore the dangers of interpreting the logos of Christian theology in terms of the logos of discursive non-Christian thought. Already in ancient times, their position was resolutely anti-modern. They were adamant that Christian culture be lived through an ascetic, noetic way of life that is directed beyond the horizon of the finite, beyond the concerns of the immanent. They recognized that the good and the right could only be understood in terms of the holy, which is encountered in the persons of the Trinity. They realized that it is the cultivation of the Christian life through almsgiving, asceticism, and vigils that supports and frames authentic Christian culture and theology. We're now to the end, the last section, 3 more pages. The title is, What Does All This Have to Do with Modernity? The transforming philosophical dialectic that emerged in the second millennium West, binding theology and metaphysics, philosophy in the fourth sense, initially produced 2 unsatisfactory options. The first affirmed an analogy between our being, created being, and the uncreated being and essence of God. The nature of the unknowable God was held to be in the unknowable. In reaction to this view, there developed an appreciation among late medieval nominalists and some mystics that the unknowable character of the Judeo-Christian God had been obscured. The reaction was not to return to the traditional theology of the first half millennium, but instead to articulate within nominalist commitments a voluntaristic God, as, for example, among the Occamites. This led to the presentation of a God who was in his essence capricious. There is, though, a third option, one other than that of a God whose nature can be known by created being, and other than God, and another God who can, through discursive knowledge, philosophy, be affirmed as radically voluntary. The third option appreciates that God will be who he will be, and he will do what he wills to do. However, this appreciation is set within the experience of the uncreated energies of a transcendent God, an encounter with a particular personal God. This third option, affirmed by the Sixth Ecumenical Council held in Constantinople 1341, 47, and 1351, recognizes the transcendent God of Abraham, Moses, and the Christians of the first half millennium. In addition, it crucially acknowledged that this God is known not through philosophical reflection, but in personal encounter. The difference of the third option from the second option is anchored in the circumstance that it is the fruit of an actual encounter with the Trinity, the personal source of all being. Modernity grows from the first option. Reason's confidence in its metaphysical capacities to lay out the nature of existence and then critically existence, which, when critically deflated in the Enlightenment, left discursive reason with the diminished charge of exploring the grammar of knowledge and the structure of immanent reality. Philosophy in the fourth sense gave way to philosophy in the sixth and eighth sense. Man's existence was by default set within the horizon of the finite. Modernity involves accepting the horizon of the finite and the immanent as a taken for granted defining element of the human condition. This requires precisely not yearning for the infinite. In fact, it involves forgetting about the transcendent and instead living in the immanent without regret. This became possible for Christian culture only insofar as it lost its radically ascetic, noetic focus on the persons of the Trinity. The scholastic turn to speculative philosophy as a core element of theology marked the beginning of a momentous change in the relationship among humans, theology, and Christian culture. Discursive rationality and speculative reason were authorized to order and judge theological content, and finally, even to transform the theology, itself into a moral philosophy, indistinguishable from secular moral reflection. The priority of discursive thought was then warranted to recast Christian theology either into a post-traditional theology or into a moral philosophy congenial to the contemporary culture. For example, Christians acculturated within modernity can now invoke this rationality so as to rename the God who names himself and call him, for example, mother rather than father. Such modern Christians thus recast the Trinity under such terms as compassionate mother, beloved child, and life-giving womb. Second, the embrace of discursive reflection at the very core of theology can also warrant Western Christian culture being transformed into secular culture so that, as Gianni Vattimo appreciates, it issues in the contemporary dominant secular culture whose requirements trump the requirements of traditional Christianity and transform as far as possible the place and reception of traditional Christianity. In time, this commitment to a cardinal role for discursive philosophy in theology recasts Christian concerns with almsgiving and charity into social justice. This commitment transforms as well the pursuit of holiness into the pursuit of human rights. As it became clear that finite concepts and arguments could not compass an infinite God, the proofs that had been advanced for the existence of God at the beginning of the 20th century become recognized as crucially flawed. From the finite, one cannot conclude to the infinite. Because discursive philosophical reflection could not provide its promised proofs for the existence of God, this failure suggested to Western culture God's non-existence. Despoiled of a noetic experience of reality, philosophy recognized that man was confined within the sphere of sense impressions, articulated within the sphere of the finite and the immanent. Discursive philosophy, now reduced to philosophy of the seventh sense, could not bootstrap itself beyond the sphere of the finite to God. The hubris of scholasticism turned out to usher in the agnosticism of modernity. The ontological crisis of modernity is tied to the collapse of the metaphysics of the High Middle Ages that it had developed in order to secure, as it promised, proofs for God's existence. This metaphysics was offered as a surrogate anchor for the emerging Western Christian culture. It was to substitute for the secular struggle that leads to noetic knowledge, which had been abandoned as theology moved from monasteries to the academy. After Kant, and looking to postmodernity, Hegel understood this well. It is for this reason that he placed the transcendent in a sphere of immanence, within which one could have no regret for the loss of a true metaphysical anchor in the living God. Immanence came to be affirmed as all there is, without a regret or even a remembrance of the depths of Christian theological experience. Against this background, within the horizon of the finite and the immanent, and having only sense-based knowledge and discursive rational reflection, one can understand the now notorious remark of Gianni Vattimo and its ironic meaning, quote, "I have become an atheist thanks to Jesus." The secular culture has severed the culture of Christianity from the transcendent God, affecting a philosophical kenosis. One is left with encountering the cultural and social message associated with Jesus, but cut off from any metaphysical anchor. After all, given modernity's epistemology, the bold claims on behalf of the early 2nd century metaphysics could not be vindicated. One was left with a sphere of human sense impressions so that one can never reach beyond the finite to the infinite. The aspiration for the infinite could then be effectively domesticated. Moreover, the second millennium aspiration to have philosophy guide philosophy, theology, is thus only cast but not abandoned. The result is at best a non-denominational religion, not quite as Marcello Pera in his dialogue with Pope Benedict XVI suggests. One is left, as already noted, with a secularized Christian culture where charity has been transformed into social justice and the passionate pursuit of holiness into the passionate pursuit of human rights. Crucial for the spiritual healing of Western culture is the experience of the unknowable God, which experience constitutes theology in the third sense. It is both the fruit of and support for a spiritual way of life. This way of life is sustained not in the academy, but in ascetic struggles. Its great theologians are the church's spiritual athletes. In contrast, the appreciation of God through theology in the first and second senses supports an intellectual, imminently directed way of life, one of the cardinal roots of modernity. The Christian response to this state of affairs cannot be, as Marcello Pera in his dialogue with the then Cardinal Ratzinger suggests it should be, namely, to build non-denominational monasteries. Humans know in their hearts that the God who lives is a very particular God, seeking a very particular people in very particular monasteries. The way out of the problems of modernity lie in the response of the Christianity that transformed the secular world of the first half millennium, namely, through the ascetic liturgical pursuit of theology as the experience of God. The prayer of traditional Christian monasteries is more powerful than any of the technologies of modernity. The metaphysically rootless character of modernity can be cured only when our culture is again rooted in the Trinity. A civil religion, even a non-denominational Christian civil religion, will not cure the problems of modernity. Our ultimate and only truly effective weapon is not the soundness of our arguments, but the holiness of Christians, who through holiness given by God can transform and restore our modern culture. The first is a web of words. The second is the power of God. Thank you very much.
We have 15 minutes remaining in our allotted time, and I'm sure that if we prevail on Professor Engelhardt, he may have something more to say.
Ma'am, sir.
Yes, you mentioned that the teaching according to the Savior is complete and does not need anything more. The approach of truth does not make it more powerful, right?
I quoted Clement of Alexandria, who died in 230, yes.
All right, and I think we have to distinguish between the use of reason based on bodily knowledge of passions, because
What's reason based on faith?
of the faith of the word of Jesus Christ.
I point out, if you're using philosophical reflection to clarify your concept, then it was fine. You wouldn't come to a new doctrine. That was surely the view of St. John Chrysostom and the other followers. You could clarify what you knew or say it better to a pagan. It was good for fighting heresy.
Yes, and
Okay?
I just have a few more questions, like, just going on with this. And I
Sure.
think that we as humans, because of Adam's sin, we have natural inclination to the passions and to concupiscence. And because of this, I think that it is important to live life in a way that does not diverge from Christ's teachings, but by the use of reason, you can combat this concupiscence through dialogue. And Augustine and Aquinas still relied on faith to base their arguments, whereas modernists such as Voltaire and Nietzsche stress the subjectivity of the individual. So I think it's dangerous to compare postmodernism to this Thomistic philosophy, which is based on theology. That I think it's theology, which guides philosophy, not philosophy which guides theology, which you quoted.
I disagree with you. First of all, I disagree with you with respect to what happened when Adam sinned. Anybody who goes to Texas knows the following things happen. One, we have passions. Two, we have weakness of will. We'll all get sick and we'll all die. But most important, our hearts are closed. Theology is, for the church of the first half millennium, an empirical noetic knowledge, where philosophy has the same kind of role that it has when I practice medicine. So if someone came up to me and said, I've got some good basic premises and ways to tell you how you should treat your patients in a critical care unit, I would say, you don't know what medicine is about. Now, if someone says, I can help you clarify your concepts. I can tell you anything about what medicine's about, but I can get you maybe a better nomenclature. That is what the fathers understood theology to be able to take from philosophy and nothing more. And the reason they did that is they understood that the primary loss from the sin of Adam was that we no longer walk with God. Our heart is dirty. Its noetic capacities are diminished. One restores those by living a Christian life. Then you will be in union with God. The great theologians of the 20th and 21st century, they're doing theology by restoring their nous, something like cleaning the dirt off your microscope so that you can again see God. The theology of the first half millennium is at its roots empirical. Ma'am.
I was just wondering if you could speak more to, we talked about the transcendence of God, which we can also find very strongly in traditional Judaism, that notion of Yahweh and the relationship with each other. But what does it mean when we talk about the incarnation and the role that Christ has? Can you speak more to the ontological change in human nature and how that changes the way we can think about God?
Hey, there's no question. The religion that's the closest to traditional Christianity is Orthodox Judaism. We know that God lives, and he's totally incomprehensible. That's why St. John Chrysostom writes on the incomprehensibility of God. That's also why we understand, in total conformity to what everyone wrote in the first few centuries, that when St. John begins the gospel and arche hen ho logos, he doesn't mean rational logic. He means in the beginning there was the Spirit, the presence of the name of God. Okay, so we with the Orthodox Jews understand both in terms of God and with the incarnation. That never goes away. No one knows the nature of God. They now are in heaven. No one knows the nature of God. We encounter him, and we live in his uncreated energies. What the incarnation did was not to pay any debt we owed to anything. God didn't kill his son because he had to kill someone. St. Isaac the Syrian said, if God has any justice, it's like grains of sand before mountains of mercy. Adam, who summed up the human race, willed to unite himself with the devil. And if you want to read the best statement of why Christ came, read the anaphora of the liturgy of St. Basil. We had united ourselves with death, with the evil one. Only a human who is also God could disconnect us from death and restore us to life. It's that term which is affected by Christ. So as St. Athanasius says, God became man so that men could become gods by grace. But we only become gods by grace, not by nature. We participate in his energy, never in his nature. And so, yes, the incarnation changes our capacity to clear our hearts. So following Matthew, with a pure heart we can see God. And so if you meet a Holy Father of the 21st century, Holy Fathers are people who see. I'll tell you a story. Orthodox Christianity is just about stories. I'm a grandfather, I'm an old man, and you see the priest right over there. He's the father of three of my grandchildren ex utero, and a fourth one, God willing, who will be born in February. When his wife, not yet the wife of a priest, was in Alaska, I was at a conference on Colborth. And as you can tell, that there are two similarities between me and Fidel Castro. We both have beards and we both like to talk forever. And so I was there in Pasadena, California, called up my wife, and since this was his wife's first baby, I was concerned that she'd be there to deliver the baby. Practically, they lived on Alaska. It takes 2 hours, lived at that point in Alaska. It took 2 hours for the midwife to show up. Well, I called up my wife and said, you know, if the midwife doesn't show up, you can deliver a baby. Just kind of change your perspective, and if you need any problems, call me up and I'll walk you through it. I mean, I delivered a whole bunch of babies. I mean, you only had 3, but you know. And so I didn't hear from her, and I flew back to Houston. I checked my voicemail. There was nothing on my voicemail. I went to sleep. About an hour after I went to sleep, I heard fax. I woke up. Who's faxing me? And here comes out the fax. It's from Mount Athos, from the monastery of Vatopedi. And it says, Herman, congratulations on the birth of your new grandchild, the monk Isidore. The monastery celebrates. I called up my wife. I said, you schmuck. Dorothea gave birth and you didn't call me. And she said, well, you know, the midwife almost didn't show up. We were so exhausted. You know, I was going to call you tomorrow morning. How the heck did you find out? I said, well, in this corrupt world, you can't trust wives anymore. At least you can trust holy monks. That's what it is to have your heart clear. That's why theology is an empirical science. That's why our holy fathers may not have graduated from high school. This guy has a degree in civil engineering from Louisiana. Anybody who thinks nothing good can come from Louisiana, this is a counterexample. You're not, who is the other? Yes, sir.
Historiographical question for you. I'm very sympathetic to the idea that modernity is a secularization of Western Christianity. If this is the case, would you, I suspect then that some of what we're calling post-modernity isn't so much a new paradigm opening up as modernity really having to live with its own presuppositions for the first time and not post on the confidence of the medieval Catholic synthesis. What would you think about this?
Yeah. I mean, a liaison between theology and this beautiful handmade philosophy takes place over centuries. Begins to create in the 12th and 13th century a Western theology that is just incomprehensible to the church of the first 500 years. I mean, the idea that one would give proofs of the existence of God is, for the church of the first half millennium, bizarre. It's as if I would go home to my wife, and my wife would say to me, Tris, I've got 5 proofs for your existence. And beyond that, I read through the proslogium and I recast Anselm's 2 ontological proofs, and I got an ontological proof of the existence of the husbands. You're probably it. Now, I would recognize that that would be a message to tell me our relationship was in really bad difficulty, and you shouldn't travel that much. Well, the Christians first half millennium, if you experience God, why would you ever want to prove for Him? My wife doesn't need a proof for me. I mean, for better or worse, she experiences me. When one thought that theology got from philosophy a way of justifying its moral and metaphysical claims, it became hostage to the conceits and the fads of philosophy. If you listen to modern theologians, they'll say, well, gee, you know, for a while we drew on this philosophy, then we found this other philosophy, now we got a brand new way of seeing everything. Well, that's what St. John Chrysostom says will happen if you internalize philosophy. You're caught up with the conceits and images and fashions of the day. Now, what happens, the other crucial issue, when you don't know that theology is the capacity to experience God, and in experiencing God, noetically to experience reality. You're just lost like David, who knows? I mean, one of the three most important things that happened in 1776, the publication of The Wealth of Nations, the death of David Hume, and what's the other thing? I'm a Texan, I don't know. But Hume understands if you can't get to heaven, if you don't have a nous, you're just stuck in sense impressions. That all of the aged intellects in the world will never get you there. You just have sense impression. Kant still thinks that there's an ahistorical grammar for sense impression. Hegel says no. The conceits are always historically grounded. So there's not one sense of rationality that will tell the story of the hermeneutic of our finite and immanent world, and you're off to post-modernity. Peter Gay, who's one of my favorite historians of the Enlightenment, always says that Enlightenment is the return of pagan philosophy, and pagan philosophy is polytheist. You get to pick out the god or goddesses whose various stories you like the very most, and postmodernity is to come back again, just like St. John Chrysostom said it would come back. If you put at the center of theology, not the experience of the living God noetically, but put at the center discursive philosophy. Yes?
Final question?
Yeah, the question is this. I sometimes think of multiculturalism as the last vestiges of Christendom in Western thinking, albeit thoroughly disconnected from its origins. Could you comment on your theology of culture, Genesis 11 and Revelation, and how they're connected?
Well, you must tell me what you... the origin of culture is cult. The term culture means kolo, to plow. It also means to burn incense. It also means to gain refinement. The Orthodox Christian would understand that all cultures are false that are not traditionally Christian. Because it's only in right worship and right belief that I finally am freed from my passions, that my will is strengthened, and I will experience the God who lives. So we'll tolerate multiple cultural perspectives, but we sure think it's a bad thing. We're not into diversity. We want everyone to be baptized and be saved. So we understand that there is one God who compasses all of this and can cultivate us in right worship and right belief. Now, there are 4 Western rites in the Orthodox Church. When I go I travel all over the world, and I go from Serbian churches to Japanese churches, and after liturgy in Tokyo, they have sushi rather than barbecue. But those differences of multicultural perspectives are trivial. That which endures is our bond to the Trinity, who is the same forever and who will redeem us if we turn to that Trinity. Let me thank you for your patience. What a joy and pleasure to have such a serious discussion with you.